welcome to the Halakhah literature in this institution.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I will try to do some 20 minutes. Thank you to all of you. Can you hear me? Can everyone hear me? Thank you very much. I appreciate this. And my session here will follow nicely on the discussion we just had and on the comments that Professor Rosner just mentioned. That it's a pleasure to see some of you again. And I just want to raise a number of issues with you today that really relate to the differences with regard to the internet and some of the real differences that we are facing today and the way we look at these differences. So I'm going to do the following. I'm going to speak for about 5 minutes, 4 to 5 minutes in introducing the issues. I'm then going to speak for about 10 minutes on the issue of the Rava Virtuali, of the virtual rabbi, which is really the subject of this paper that I'm working on. And then I'm going to conclude with a couple of minutes of conclusion, and then I think we will be fine in terms of time, and if not, Rabbi Yonathan will come back to haunt me. So this is where we are. Let me start with a brief introduction. First of all, what are we talking about in terms of the virtual rabbi and the internet presence of the rabbi? That is part of what we are now understanding to be, over the past 15 to 20 years, an increasing profile of religious organizations and religious authority figures on the internet. The subject has been studied over the past 15 years, and especially over the past 7 to 8 years, by a number of scholars, especially Golan and Campbell and Boymel, a number of scholars who have written about this, and the increase of the presence of religious authorities in the internet has been marked from the Baha'i culture to Islamic culture to fundamentalist Christianity and to Judaism, and in Judaism, particularly interestingly, Orthodox Judaism and especially modern Orthodox Judaism, that has really dominated the presence of religious figures in the internet, with an increase over the past 6 to 7 years of ultra-Orthodox groups on the internet that I will only speak to very marginally and that are very interesting. It's a very interesting subject that has arisen in two ways. Number one, what we are seeing is an increase in the number of sites in the context of which rabbis present themselves on the internet. The largest site of the kind is a site called kippah.org. And Kippah in 2013, about 3 years ago, increased its, I want you to understand the scope of this, increased the number of hits to the site to about 40,000 per day on average. I want you to understand the scope of it. This is really quite unique and by far the largest in the world in terms of Jewish sites. There are a number of sites like this. There are now ultra-Orthodox sites. So now ultra-Orthodox sites that are dedicated to women, that are women's sites, that also receive a great deal of attention. But now we're no longer talking about some kind of a startup phenomenon. We are now talking about a significant cultural phenomenon, and one that we're really studying quite carefully with the tools that I'm going to be discussing in a few moments. So that's number one, that's number two. And the other thing, the other part of it, has been not only the presence of rabbis on the internet, on websites wherein they're asked questions and they respond to these questions in a way that I'm going to address again in a moment, but we're also talking about rabbis responding to questions via email and SMS. And these rabbis responding to email and SMS, the phenomenon has yet again increased. The number of rabbis are leading the way in this regard. We're talking about basically today a dozen to 1.5 dozen rabbis who are really prominent in this area. Among them, we know of Rav Aviner, for example, here in this country, who during the war in Lebanon, famously the second war in Lebanon, responded to over 300 SMS questions per day. And one of the issues that has arisen in the journal tradition has, for example, been a debate in 2012, 2013 about the publication of these SMS responses. And now really we're looking at a corpus of thousands, literally thousands of these SMS so-called responsa that we're going to talk about for a little bit. The way the scholarship has developed on this has been particularly interesting, and I'd like to bring this to your attention. I'd like to talk to you about this because this is part of what I do now and of something that is of great interest to me. The issues that have arisen with rabbis on the internet have raised three particular questions that really come from anthropology and sociology, that emerge to us from the fields of anthropology and sociology. And they relate to three challenges that arise in the context of the internet. Number one has to do with membership. The great problem of membership. Who is a member who participates in the debate in the context of any kind of rabbinic presence on the internet? What is the membership like? Who are the people who respond? Who are the people who ask? Who are the intermediaries? What is the membership of this? Because the internet is open. And one of the challenges of the internet is the openness of the internet, which we started touching on just a little bit ago, but membership is a real issue, and it's a social issue. It's an issue of social organization when it comes to the internet, and that's one major issue that arises. A second issue relates to authority, the authority of the rabbi, the authority of the posek on the internet, and the authority of those who may be challenging the rabbi on the internet. There are issues that arise with regard to authority in a whole number of different ways that we may want to really speak about that are very significant issues. And the third issue which is related is an issue of boundaries and identity control in terms of these particular internet sites. How do you maintain a sense of identity and communal control in the context of the internet? And this really lays the groundwork for the work that we're going to be looking at with regard to the virtual rabbi, the Rabbi virtuali. And this is a debate that started 12 to 13 years ago, again with Rabbi Biner and Rabbi Valshel and a whole number of others who weighed in on this over the years and who have led us to where we are today. And it's an interesting subject for us to be talking about today because it's exploding. In certain ways, it's booming, and in ways that we have not necessarily foreseen. So let me go to the Rabbi virtuali and to talk about the virtual rabbi. The virtual rabbi is the rabbi who responds to internet questions presented to him over the internet, and right now it is only to him because we really are talking about an orthodox phenomenon to date, though we are starting to see the beginnings of this changing, but right now to him on the internet. And these questions are characterized by the following. Number one, it is the anonymity of the sender of the question and the immediacy of the question that is sent to the respondent. And while this whole phenomenon has many benefits, Rabbi Biner already points out 12, 13 years ago that there's a number of challenges that are associated with this particular phenomenon. And they do relate, for example, to the anonymity of the questioner. They relate to the inability of the respondent to verify, to check. They relate to the inability to follow up, and they relate to a superficiality in the communication between the questioner and the respondent and back. This gives rise to a debate that arises in the context of our discussion with regard to the virtual rabbi, and a debate that is in certain ways continuing. And the difference is that the debate has taken place among rabbis over the first 7 to 8 years and has now moved to scholarly lines and to very interesting scholarly lines, as I'm about to describe later. And I want to take a few moments to explain why this is significant and what is really the point that we are really trying to look into and are trying to figure out. In our classical mode of response of She'elot Teshuvot, those that were composed before printing and those that were composed after printing, typically there had been an intermediary between the posek and the issue that arose that the posek had to refer to, had to weigh in on, had to offer guidance on. And the intermediary was a communal rabbi. The communal rabbi who could read and write, the communal rabbi who could synthesize some kind of a dispute among parties or between parties in his local community, a communal rabbi who would be able to present a question, to be able to receive back a response, and then to be able to implement the response in his local community. Because the intermediate rabbi was the gatekeeper to the posek, to the great posek, whether it was Rabbi Gershom Meor, whether it was Rabbi Meir of Rothenburg, whether it was the Rashba, whether it was the Maharik, whether it was Karo, all of these rabbis received questions from people who could read and write, the questions were not questions of fact, because the posek couldn't verify questions of fact. Issues of fact were verified before the she'ela was sent out. The she'ela was a question of law, was a question of halakhah. And the posek only weighs in on halakhah, on the question of law, that then becomes implemented at the local level in the context of what we see of the implementation of the tshuva. Part of this is private and part of this is public. It is only the question of halakhah that is then published in these books, in the volumes of halakhah that we see right now. What has happened in the meantime? 3 things have happened in the meantime that I think are worth noting and that are the subject of my study. Number 1, there's an issue of halakhic process. Traditionally, the process of the she'ela tshuva is the culmination of a halakhic investigation that reaches some kind of a dead end locally. Facts are investigated, there's a discovery that takes place, there's an attempt often at dispute resolution before a she'ela is sent out to a posek. Only then, when things fail, or a posek is asked to offer support to a local rabbi for a whole range of other political reasons, a question is asked to a posek, and then some kind of a tshuva is received, a response is received from the posek. What has happened right now is the opposite. Nothing has taken place. A person asks an internet question to a posek, and that is the first time we hear of that person. In fact, that person is anonymous. The entire halakhic process that has taken place in the traditional notion of she'ela tshuva has now been cancelled, is no longer there. The first time the posek hears about a person is in the context of this she'ela, which the posek now wishes to return to. Now, in the context of this she'ela, there's obviously often no synthesis, there is no detail with regard to facts, there are a whole range of vaguenesses and issues that arise. The question that arises for us, what are the implications of this altering of the halakhic process? Number 2, we ask ourselves a sociological question. The sociological question beyond the question of halakhic process is, since the whole she'ela tshuva process relied on a pre-modern notion of community and of a sense of authority, of rabbinic authority, leading up to a posek, typically a highly respected posek of that time. Since that is the case, the ability of any individual to send a question to a person who is a posek, what does that do to the community rabbi? And what does that do by implication to the Jewish community, to the synagogue-based community, to the Jewish community that is a local community, with a person, a guide, a teacher, who touches people's lives, who can guide people, who can work with people, who can teach people? What does it do to the community? And sociologists and anthropologists are now looking at that particular question, at the relationship between that question of community and the rise of this internet medium, of the internet responsa. The question here is sociological, anthropological in nature, and the question is what happens to community in the context of what we are seeing as the evidence of this particular mode of communication. And the third question that arises, that's a particularly important question for us, is literary. It's a literary question. And here we come with the tools of literary criticism and literary study. What can we tell about this literature here? The contemporary literature, and I'm not talking about SMS response, and by the way, you know that the shortest response that has ever been offered by a sage in the Jewish tradition was offered by the Rambam, who was asked about the kashrut of a pot, the kashrut of a vessel, whose response at tshuva was lo, was no. In other words, SMS responsa, these things have already, this is not entirely new, but the process is new, part of the literature is new, the way the literature is implemented is new, The public side of it is new. The private side of it is virtually non-existent. The question is, from a literary perspective, in terms of the literary tools that we bring to the study of these particular texts, can we actually talk about responsa, about she'elot u'tshuvot, in the way that we would normally talk about she'elot u'tshuvot, or are we really talking about an entirely new genre of rabbinic literature that has more to do with outreach, with asiyat nefashot, with bringing near, with a sense of guidance and teaching that is less normative? Is this really she'elot u'tshuvot as we understand them? Is the virtual rabbi truly a virtual rabbi posek, as the virtual rabbi posek would have been? Or is this a new animal? Is this a new genre of literature that we're seeing arise? So these are the three questions. I want to, again, repeat briefly the three questions that I'm asking. The three questions that I'm asking relate to halachic process. And this is where the meta-halachic discussion borders on the Halakhah itself. And that has to do with the halachic process. What do we do here with halachic process? What are the implications of the changes in halachic process? Number two, the question is sociological, anthropological, about community. And number three, it is literary. What do we do with this new literary genre? Are we really talking about responsa? Are we really talking about she'elot u'tshuvot in the way that we have understood she'elot u'tshuvot? So right now we're looking at what we today estimate, and I just spoke with Campbell a few days ago, what we estimate to be 115 to 120,000 texts on the internet right now that we're looking at. And what we're looking at right now are between 18 and 19,000 SMS responsa that we know to have been published. Beyond these, we know that there are fora of women, Haredi women. I've discussed this for a moment before, I just want to mention it, and other fora that are arising in ultra-Orthodox circles, wherein normative questions are asked and responded without any reference to a rabbi. The question is how these discussions are handled, how is this choreographed, who asks the questions, who responds to these questions, what is then being published on the site, what remains hidden, in other words, is not published on the site, because we know that that which is out there on sites can never disappear. It is permanent, it is characterized by permanence, but that which is not on sites is also invisible. There is another side to it. In other words, how reliable is the data that we have about this? And I want to tell you, the questions that are asked are phenomenal questions. Let me just take a second to address this. Among the questions that I found just recently, last year, why does a certain community, a certain Hasidic community, I don't want to mention names here, a certain Hasidic community doesn't eat carrots on Pesach? What is it about carrots on Pesach that a certain ultra-Orthodox Hasidic community in Brooklyn, they do not eat carrots on Pesach? Well, it turns out in the old country, the Alter-Heim, the older country out there in Belarus or the Ukraine, the carrot field was near a wheat field. And they were concerned about the issues that arose in the context of, for example, another question, how do you dust a room with a broom? How do you dust a room with a broom? Do you dust a room with a broom towards the middle of the room or towards the door? This is a very important question. No, there's a more, okay. No, so you dust it, yes, so in a particular tradition you dust it, and again I don't want to mention names, you dust it towards the middle of the room to be far away from the mezuzah so that there should be no dust around. I mean, these are the kinds, in other words, we're talking about questions of norms and of practice and of ways of life that are being asked that are normative, that we understand to be normative because they influence people's practice and people's lives. And this is a whole new phenomenon that is arising that's fascinating, that's very interesting, that allows people, that allows especially women who had not had a voice to date, to now belong to these fora and to participate and to ask questions and to respond and to share. I'm sorry?
To ask questions, not to answer.
No, but also to answer. Some of them, they also answer, they respond, and by the way, because there are email addresses, we do not see what is happening privately. Again, there is that which is seen through the website, which is choreographed, which is regulated, and which seeks to maintain identity. And that's part of the sociology anthropology part of the question. And then there is the private side, which is hidden, which makes it much more difficult and much more interesting in terms of our study of this. I'm afraid that I'm out of time. I don't want Yonatan to come and haunt me, but I am seeing the clock in front of me. This is really the subject of the work that I'm doing right now.
Do you want to go first?
I want to ask about your description of the old shoot. It seems to ring very true to a certain form of large-scale commercial dispute, but it does not seem to be the way a Yeridaic, but meaning like your description of like the rabbi and he's there and he's a mediator, right? So this is when you have like din Torah and the guy gets stuck and then you sign off. But there's all sorts of shooting that don't have that structure. And in that sense, I wonder whether picking on that, because a lot of these questions on the internet are more like, is this chicken kosher? Right? So there's a sense in which what was verbal is now becoming written, and I wonder like how big a gap that is. And on the other hand, your description of how shootim seems to describe a certain type of shoot, which is actually not the one that's now getting discussed on the internet, which seems to be of a different format. Then I wonder whether the question of the rabbinic intermediator is that.
So again, let me respond to that in a number of different ways, and let me just first of all, for shortage of time, you're right. Basically, you're right. And what we see in the volume of response of Shalot Tshuvot is a mix of different types of shoot and of different really genres there, including some publicistic material, some Shalot Tshuvot along the model that I've described, other Shalot Tshuvot according to other models, some articles appearing in a whole correspondence. I mean, there's a whole number of different things appear in Shalot Tshuvot that we today call Shalot Tshuvot, but that sometimes weren't intended to be Shalot. I mean, there's a whole. So the question is far more complex than what I've let on, but for shortage of time yet again, I mean, we have to, that's number one. Number two, the question of the kosher chicken or the kosher pot typically did not have to be asked of a posek. That's exactly the question you could go to.
Depends what you mean by pot.
I'm sorry?
Depends what you mean by pot.
Okay, but so there's sometimes questions that become really significant questions about the air inside the pot. And whether something that touches the air inside the pot. Now we have a whole discussion in the Gemara that becomes a discussion also that appears twice in the Shalot Tshuvot as well. Okay, that's very nice. But this is not your typical question about the kashrut of the chicken and so on and so forth. This actually is less interesting. The fact that this occurs through the internet, to me, is less interesting. What is interesting to me are precisely those questions where there had been an intermediary. Because there, now what we're seeing is a sociological change that occurs in the structure of community, in the structure of communication between the questioner and a posek and a rabbi, and that, to me, is interesting. And the question is whether the electronic changes, the electronic media changes that are taking place, are also going to be borne out in sociological, anthropological changes that we're going to see on the ground. That, to me, is of greater significance.
My question is this any different than what happened when they introduced the telegraph? It's well known that postum took to the telegraph very intensely, and since you have to pay by the letter when you use the telegraph, they took to writing very short tshuvot. And there are piles and piles of telegraphs from various posting at various times that look very much like SMS letters, full of abbreviations and so on and so forth, writing Yiddish in characters. I wonder if the phenomena that you're describing is merely old wine in a new vessel, rather than new wine.
So there's two. I'll answer very briefly and just in a shape really, a shape like him. I will answer you. Number one, first of all, there's a difference in scope between the telegraph response. And by the way, Chabad introduced this in the 1980s using the fax machine. So the whole, this is not new. You're absolutely right. This goes back to the late 19th century. with a telegraph. The scope of this, number one, is completely different. That's number one. And number two, when you look into it, and when you study it, and some people have studied this, and we can talk about that, the people who were asked, the poskim who were asked questions, were typically local rabbis who were asked by their congregants these kinds of questions when there was no access. There was no access to the rabbi. A person was traveling, a person was here, a person was there. They went out and they asked. There were the number of real she'elot that were of interest, wherein there would have been an intermediary, is relatively limited among them. Here we're looking at a very different kind of animal. We're looking at, substantively, in terms of the questions, a very different kind of animal. And I urge you to look at some of these sites. Some of this material is fascinating. And it has to do with interfaith relations, it has to do with interpersonal relations, it has to do with issues of Torah. There's a whole number of, and some of it is fascinating material. So number one, there's an issue of scope. Number two, the sociological and the substantive qualities of these questions that are asked, and sometimes of responses that are lengthy responses, that are not telegraph responses, render this material different.
Just a short comment. I'm a physician, and I just want to say that all the three questions are a real issue in medicine today.
Yes.
My talk later will be on what you call the Halakhah process, what exactly had changed with the medical process, but the same issue with the post-sec and the local is like in my clinic every day, patients send emails to professors in the States, and I see that all the time. And patients are doing medical experiments by their own. So everything that you are talking about, there are real discussion in the medical world, and the same thing happened in medicine today.
So I don't want to take any more time, and I know that Rabbeinu Tam is here at the door coming to honor me, but I will say to you that in America, the vast majority of these short responses are medical. They're medical, to rabbis.
טוב, אנחנו עוברים